I'd like to give you a quick overview of the history of England for the purpose of grounding you a little bit historically before we start studying the literature written in Old English. Why are we even reading this old stuff in a survey of British literature? Originally, it goes back to the fact that when the discipline of English was developed in the 19th century in England, it was grounded in philology, the study of the history of the language. People looked at these texts in classes because they were interested in how the language developed. They weren't really reading it as literature, but as examples of language. Once we get into the 20th century, particularly around World War II, the shift of study moves toward literary history, literary analysis, not just literary philology. But the syllabus tends to hang on to the old texts, though we're reading them now mostly in translation, partly because the study of culture and history is still relevant, and the works are actually really interesting. So let's get our grounding in history. Everybody knows about Stonehenge. That's way before anything in this course goes. Stonehenge is Bronze Age. That would be contemporary with, shall we say, ancient Troy. When we get into the Iron Age, that's when things get actually kind of interesting. We have tribes migrating from Europe to the island. There isn't actually a whole lot of population during the Bronze Age. A lot of the people that we have, the Celts, actually have come from Europe to the island during the Iron Age, and they become known as the Britons. Don't ask me why they're called that, they are. This is where Druids come from. They have no connection whatsoever to Stonehenge, to be perfectly honest. What's going on in the rest of the world? In ancient Greece, Homer, one of the oldest of the ancient Greek writers, is writing the Iliad and the Odyssey. Okay. Now we're done with the Greek Empire. Now it's time for the Roman Empire. Good old Julius Caesar invades the island in 54. There were 2 expeditions, no particular settlement. The real settlement happens around 80 AD, or Common Era. England, or the island that we know, the area we know of as England, becomes actually a Roman colony. Language is the language of the occupiers. There's a military force present at all times. The Celts, or the Britons, as they're more commonly called when they're particularly in England, have been speaking Brittonic and continue to speak Brittonic. We only have like a couple of words left from their language because essentially Latin kind of took everything over in written form. The Romans actually were quite busy on the island. They built towns, they built roads, they built spa towns, they built stone walls, they built forts, they built palaces. The most important thing is they built in stone, so the stuff lasted. So Britannia, here it is. The part to the north of Hadrian's Wall is where the Picts and the Scots were. They were considered terrible barbarians. The Romans tried to have nothing whatsoever to do with them. So what's going on here that you will know about the northern wall that Hadrian built, because it shows up in various works of fiction in the present day and such. So what's interesting here, around 313, Constantine permits Christianity in the Roman Empire. The Romans have been pagan up until this point. About 100 years later, in 410, the Roman legions who have been occupying the island begin to withdraw because the Roman Empire is beginning to unravel, mainly because of problems with barbarians on the move. Attila the Hun, for example. The occupying army and merchants and everybody who's been sort of going there to the empire go back home to Rome, or wherever in the Roman Empire they are from. The Britons, who have always been there, just stay put. Okay, trouble is we got the Picts and the Scots in the north. The Roman occupying army has left. They're interested in moving south. The Britons, at this moment, their king is somebody named Vortigern, decides to invite some German mercenaries over from the continent to help out. So Hengist and Horsa are invited over, and this turns out to be a very bad idea because Hengist and Horsa bring all of their friends and all of their relatives, and for the next 100 years, the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes come over from the continent and decide to settle on the island formerly known as Britannia. Why do we know this? Because we have a monk named Gildas, who is based in Wales on our map. That's that little green bit to the left there. Wrote a history of what happened. So where are we around the year 600? We got a bunch of Germanic tribes have just moved in. They've established 5 kingdoms: Northumbria to the north, Mercia kind of in the middle, East Anglia, Kent, and Wessex are the 5 main countries, each of which has its own king. They're all practicing paganism, kind of in the style of, what the Norsemen would be doing. That's probably the best cognate for you. They're speaking an early form of English. It's a Germanic language. The Angles, for some reason, got their name attached to it, so it's known as Anglish, or what we would now call English. It doesn't look much like modern English, but it looks more like modern English than like anything else. And they don't actually write much, but they do carve stone, and they use a runic alphabet, which has nice all straight lines, easy for carving, mainly used for writing on ceremonial things and such. The Britons, who have been there for a long time actually, have kind of moved out of the way. They've moved west. They've gone to Cornwall, the farthest westmost point of southern England. They've moved into Wales, and they've moved overseas to a corner of France called Brittany, which is going to become rather important later on. They have continued to be Christians this entire time. The language they're speaking is Brittonic, which becomes an ancestor of the modern language of Cornish and the modern language Welsh and Breton, which is actually still spoken in that part of France. It's a Celtic, these are Celtic languages. They continue to use the Latin alphabet, though admittedly they are not actually writing anything much around this time period. Okay, we still have the Christians in Rome, which is not really quite a Roman Empire anymore. It's sort of sliding into a Holy Roman Empire. But we do have the Pope there. And in 597, he decides to re-Christianize the island formerly known as Britannia. He sends one of his clergy, a fellow named Augustine, to the Kingdom of Kent to convert the pagans who are there. And it takes a while. For quite a while, you have sort of this merging of pagan and Christian culture. If you look at the Sutton Hoo burial site, which is not too far away from Kent, it's actually in East Anglia, you will see mixed Christian and pagan grave goods. This little brooch that you see in the upper picture here is one of these beautiful designs that came out of the Sutton Hoo burial site. We start getting a little bit later Cadman, the first official poet to write in English, will write English religious poetry, but he will be using those old Germanic pagan heroic verse forms that we know that Germanic pagans used. We finally actually have the last formal pagan leader dying in 686. He dies on the Isle of Wight, that's just to the south of England, not quite a kingdom of its own most of the time. And by the 700s, well, you're still kind of seeing this mix of Christian and Germanic culture and some Roman stuff as well. Very much a blended culture, and we see this illustrated in a lovely piece of artwork called the Franks Casket, which has runes on it, it has Latin writing on it, it has Germanic narratives on it, it has Christian stories on it. It's really kind of amazing. Okay, now we're getting to the stuff that's actually in this course, the written tradition that finally begins after 600. We have brought Latin monks over. They're writing in Latin. Latin connects you to what's being, to the culture of the rest of Europe, in fact. The church spreads literacy, at least in Latin, and only for those people who are in the church. But, once you can write in Latin, you start working out later how you write in English as well. So in 700, we have one of the famous monasteries, Lindisfarne, up in Northumbria, illustrates a beautiful version of the 4 Gospels, now known as the Lindisfarne Gospels. That's the first illustration here. You can see that kind of old Celtic art is still being used here. We see an alphabet. It's a Latin alphabet, but boy, it's taking a lot of influence from the old runic alphabet, isn't it? We have in the early 700s a runic text of a poem called The Dream of the Rood, carved on what's called the Ruthwell Cross. The runic text is actually a poem in Old English. It's a Christian poem, but it's written in Old English. There are also Latin texts on this cross. So that's one of the earliest examples we have of written Old English poetry, early 700s. And then we have probably one of the most useful texts for us. The Venerable Bede in 731 completes an ecclesiastical history of the English people. It's all about how the Germanic tribes were converted. It's where we get a lot of history from, in fact. All right.